Good morning and welcome. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Brentwood Church of Christ Sunday morning Bible class. I'd like to welcome especially all of our guests to the Far East in India in, say, Swagat, and to those to the Far West in Saipan, Hafaday. Tom, would you lead us in a word of prayer as we begin?
Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this morning we have as Christians to come together and open your word and to look into the Hebrew letter and see what we can glean from it that will be beneficial in our lives, that we would take the words that you have left for us and not only learn them but to apply them. We'd ask you to be with Brother Lynn as he directs our study this morning. May open our eyes to things we may not have noticed. That our discussion this morning will be beneficial to everyone here. We'd ask you to be with this group of Christians that have come together. May our hearts be in the right place. May our minds be focused on your word. May we each day be focused on serving you as your children. We ask you to continue to be with us. Bless us in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen. Now, I was told that we have a number of online watchers in the country of India. Therefore, the greeting or welcome in Hindi for those. Saipan, it's on the far other side of the earth, so I just thought I'd take a chance that maybe there's someone watching there. Hebrews chapter 12. After chapter 11, the writer of Hebrews goes into this dialogue, really encouraging them to focus on what needs to be done. Now, chapter 11, as we studied last Sunday morning, Wednesday, deals with, as this chapter opens, a great cloud of witnesses. And as was pointed out Wednesday, virtually all of those witnesses are from prior to the law being given on Mount Sinai. So I observed that it was very interesting that the book of Hebrews deals a great deal with how much better the new law under Jesus as the high priest is than the old law. Then when he comes to giving all of these witness examples, he goes back to witnesses that are basically prior to the law and how their faith with God was counted towards their righteousness. Now, of course, almost towards the end, he does talk about the walls of Jericho, which technically were under the law of Moses. Rahab and what she did with the spies was technically under the law of Moses, though we often don't think of a specific change there other than Mount Sinai. Then following in chapter 11, he alludes to several. David alludes to Daniel only by the lion's den. And of course, there's many other examples there that we all would say are under the law of Moses as working with us. So chapter 12, read with me verses 1 through 4. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so you may not grow weary and lose heart. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. So the opening line talks about a great cloud of witness. Now, we could well speak of a great ocean of witnesses, compare them to all the sand on the seashore. Why a cloud? Now, today, in our day and age, first thought that comes to mind with the cloud is how the internet operates, and you can send things to the cloud. But biblically speaking, what is significant spiritually about using the phrase a great cloud of witness? Because could have said a great ocean of witness, could have said a great feast, any number of things. But what is the significance of clouds?
Like Moses wandering in the wilderness, God's in the cloud.
All right, I hadn't thought about God appearing as a cloud, following him. And certainly Jim is right about that Old Testament reference. A cloud is often referenced. Jesus went up into heaven, into the clouds. The sky, when we go outside and we see a sky full of clouds, they seem to go from horizon to horizon, which they literally do. Our visibility is only a few miles in any direction, but still we look at that as a great expanse, and to say the sky is filled with clouds. Angels are going to appear in the sky. So it has that spiritual connection to it that's going to do this. Now, I'm going to make a query of Brother Tim and ask him what makes a good witness, because we know Tim's background. He has little knowledge in the legal matters of the world. What makes a good witness, Brother Tim?
Well, a witness is just someone who has certain knowledge, experience, education, or training. And in this particular reference, what I see is that the author of the text has essentially gone through what sometimes we refer to as a voir dire. You've heard the word voir dire. Sometimes we use that with respect to qualifying a person as a juror, but it also applies to a witness. You have to qualify the witness as somebody who has knowledge or an experience or some particular application to the issue. And the text in chapter 11 goes through the witnesses and qualifies them as somebody who has a particular experience and knowledge with respect to their relationship with God. And so I think that's what he's referring to.
And of course, Tim is right on point with that. It'd be hard for me to recap it briefly, but Tim giving us a very detailed and knowledgeable explanation of a witness. I don't know how many here have ever been called to be a witness at a court or a proceeding, but obviously, attorneys will look to say, does this person have adequate recall in order to be a witness? Can this person verbalize what they saw, what they heard, what they experienced, so that a jury could understand it, or the judge or whatever? And do you think honesty comes into any play whatsoever with a witness? Absolutely. Now, how many times do you think the Bible refers to us as Christians as witnesses? The word appears once in the New Testament, Acts 1 and 8, referring to the apostles on Jesus' day of ascension, when he points to them and said, well, he didn't actually point, but I'm doing that for, a little classroom expression. You are to go out and be my witness, which means they had the capability of recalling what had happened. They actually had miraculous capability, because the Holy Spirit, Jesus told them the Holy Spirit would be aiding them in recalling and speaking what they had witnessed. Shortly after that, they go through the process of choosing another apostle. They put 2 men forth, and we won't talk about them casting lots, because we don't do that anymore. But one is brought forth, but the requirements for that had to have been there from the beginning, had to have witnessed these things. So us being a witness is not a popular vernacular in the church today to say, we say we're Christians. We don't even really like the term saint, because the world has, I guess, tainted that to such a level that people think we're talking about our perfection. Witness is not something we use either to say, I'm a witness for Jesus, I'm a witness for the Lord, and it does use it that one time. There are numerous other passages that talk about how we are supposed to be sharing our life. The question I have up there, are we witnesses today? And you would say, absolutely we are. But what do we witness to today? Now, I have a picture of someone standing up there in court before I go too far, because a witness, a certain amount of honesty is entailed. Tim, Brother Tim, do you know why in a court of law someone raises their right hand before they take the promise to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Well, it's generally in context of an oath. And of course, they've been into the debate of whether we're to take an oath or not take an oath, but, people make oaths,
All right, and that is correct. Now, the practice has fallen a little bit out of vogue. If you watch Perry Mason, you watch some of the TV programs, they still raise their right hand. In the old days, you'd put your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand. They don't do either of those anymore. But the practice came from the colonies, because if you were convicted of a felony, they would brand the first letter of that felony in your hand. And if you were testifying in a court as a witness, the judge wanted to see the palm of your hand. Why? To see if you'd ever been convicted of a felony, because then he was going to be very suspicious of your testimony. Now, for us, we have two avenues of witnessing today. The power of the gospel. Paul talks about that in Romans 1, about how the gospel is the power to save people. Romans 14 talks about the core gospel. Jesus came to this world, he lived, he died, he rose again on the third day, and he's returning for us. All of us can witness to that gospel proclamation. We've read it, we believe it. We were baptized for the remission of our sins based on what we believed and understood, and we can witness to our neighbor, to anyone about those. We did not personally witness any of those events. We were not at the foot of the cross when Jesus died. We didn't walk into the tomb when the stone was rolled away, but we can still witness to those facts based on the record. The other witness that we can do is our own life. That, it's not a popular term to say, well, I'm going to go and witness to my neighbor, which really means you're going to tell them about Jesus, you're going to tell them about your life, and that's where it's very important for our light to be shining, because if it doesn't, that witness process of our life is really dulled. Jack?
I was just going to say that the way these people in this chapter 11 witness, looking at their life and relationship with God, and I think that's the way we're witness, we're viewed today.
Mm-hmm.
It's how people determine what kind of life we live, our relationship with God, how we lead our life. And I think it's a key thing.
All right, and
About witness, you used to think about telling somebody about God, that's fine, but I think the way we live our lives and the way people see us and how they perceive who we are is important.
right, Jack is correct that our life, our very life, is a witness. How we talk, the words we use, the words we don't use, how we treat our family, how we treat our employer, are all witnesses of us. And certainly should be our neighbors know that we're a Christian. They should know that we're a Christian. If we haven't spoken directly to them the gospel message, certainly by the way you live and you conduct yourself. Even driving to services on Sunday morning. Traffic is so light in the Nashville area compared to a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday. And I often look and think to myself, these are all people who are going to church, until someone passes me with 3 kayaks and a motorcycle, and I think they're probably not going to church services. But I look at the people, and if I pass someone and they're wearing a shirt and tie, not that I'm pressuring anyone to put on a shirt or a tie, which has very deep pagan or origins to it. So, but you look at them and you say, those people are going to church because they're dressed a certain way, and that's our culture. That, people will dress a certain way when they go to services. So your neighbors see you go out, see you leave Sunday, Wednesday, and they're going to make certain conclusions about that if they see you go. So there's a lot of ways that we can certainly witness with our life, but our conduct, our speech, and our manner of raising our children and being an employer is a very powerful witness tool.
We can talk all day long and tell, but if our life is not a witness to, what we say is not going to mean anything. So it's a dual responsibility to speak it and to live it together.
Okay, Marcia makes a very good point. It is important in our lives that we speak of Jesus, the church, and the gospel to people we come in contact with. But it's also very important that our life shows honesty and sincerity in believing that. Otherwise, how many times have you heard someone say, churches are just full of hypocrites? Well, we're all sinners. We all have shortcomings. It's unfortunate that they look at someone's life and say they talk about Jesus, but their lifestyle is not a witness of Jesus. There was once a comment made by a Muslim person about Americans who are only Christians on Sunday morning. Well, they base that by saying what they see them doing the rest of the week in their lifestyle and their conduct and the way they behave. The next section here talks about we're to lay aside every encumbrance. The word, the Greek word, and it's used only once here in the New Testament, a bulk or a mass, but an impedance or a hindrance. Now, what are some common encumbrances? Well, I listed 3 up here that I thought are things that generally people, Christians, will struggle with. God has made us sexual beings. In the Bible, the writers of the New Testament often addressed the need for sexual purity in Christians' lives. Sometimes it was talking about their former life, about how it was so steeped in that, but it also sometimes talks to Christians who are once again entangled in that. Adultery, fornication, homosexuality are all things that can encumber people throughout their lives. Emotional weakness, often controlling ourselves and with our anger, with our striking out at people. And then verbal, lies, profanity, and I put up there silence, situation where, we can be with a group, peer pressure. We could be a community setting, it could be a family setting, and often we wonder when's the best time to speak, to say something, to defend the truth, to reason with someone, to argue with someone. But we do have to be careful that we are not silent when we really need to be vocal about Jesus, what we believe, the church. Especially in this day and age where we have science that is fighting itself against Christianity, where we have atheism, growing in this country rather than Christianity. So in looking at these encumbrances, what is the problem with being encumbered? The passage here says to lay aside every encumbrance which so easily entangles us. What's wrong with the Christian when he's entangled in sexual sins, when he's entangled by anger with weak emotion, or he's entangled with continual lies in his life? It ruins him for the service of God, ruins him with his family, ruins him with his employer, ruins him with his church. That when we become entangled in these things, now entangled means you're not able to walk, not able to run, not able to function. So, okay, he may be illustrating a high degree here of ruin, but sometimes we tend to dabble in these things very superficially. Sometimes they grow into truly encumbering us and entangling us in those things. Any questions or comments or thoughts? Yes.
The King James Version uses the word weight, that those things would weigh you down.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do those things that God.
All right. That's a very good illustration, because sometimes we think of, if you've ever gone backpacking and you put on a pack, and the first time you put it on, you've got 70 pounds of stuff in there. You're like, oh, too much. So you go through it, decide what to take out, and get it down to maybe 50 pounds to where you can carry it. What always comes to mind with me is having been a skin diver, scuba diver, weighing you down, dealing with water. Because when you get too heavy and you have to fight to struggle to stay at the surface. Now, if you're a scuba diver, you just weigh yourself down and enjoy your time under the water. But if you're swimming, or if you're snorkeling, you want that balance to where you can go up to the surface and breathe and go back down in the water. If you get too heavy and it's a struggle to stay at the surface, it's a real challenge. And you virtually will do whatever it takes to get rid of that encumbrance so you can reach the surface and so you can breathe again. So very good illustration.
Several years ago, I worked with a guy that it was often for him to say, I've really been blessed with God. It wasn't a conversation, do you go to church, Bob? You did it? No, it wasn't those kind of things. It was him was saying that something happened good. He said, I've really been blessed with God. And you begin to understand that he was more or
Right? Bob's comment was about how, people do let their light shine and people do notice and they do see things. And I know for myself, I tend to be somewhat outspoken. I don't know if you've noticed that or not. But I'll be in a line somewhere and I'll turn to the person next to me. They make eye contact. That's like saying, come on into my world and talk to me, which doesn't necessarily mean that. But I'll, in a general conversation, I may ask, do you go to church? Where do you go? And, I've been surprised since I've been here in Tennessee how many times the person will tell me, I go to the Church of Christ. And I'm kind of like, all right, well, there's no opening there, but, it does open that. I had read in a magazine once that 90% of people on an airline want to talk to the people sitting next to them. So I thought I'd try it. My wife and I were traveling. We sit down, this young lady comes in, and so I'm going to open a conversation. As soon as she sits down, well, hello, how are you? What are you doing? Oh, I'm not doing much. She turned, put in her headphones, and pulled her hoodie over her head. And I thought, all right, she must be one of them 10% that don't want to have a conversation with the person next to her. Yes.
I was just going to say what that means. I think in this context, when I see the weight and the entanglement, I think about it like being stuck in one place. Because I feel like the imagery, like before and after it, I feel like this cloud of witnesses like cheering us on, and it's if you're stuck with it, you can't focus on anything except for that. But when it's saying to lay aside, I envision it being, I have to tear that off so that I can move forward and endure the race. And until that's moved aside, I'm just stuck there. And that I like the imagery of it being like people cheering us on to just like tear all that off and go forward. And until we do that, we're kind of just stuck focusing on that because that's all we have the capacity to, because that's what's weighing us down.
Very insightful comment, especially she brought up the idea of a sporting event. Now, I have up here, fixing your eyes. What does that mean? But I have several things listed there, 1 through 4. Very common illustrations in the New Testament. Sporting competition, which addresses this specifically. And usually the main thought when Paul or one of the other writers uses a sporting competition, they're talking about endurance. Making it to the end. It's just not enough to get out. I could go to every marathon in the country, run the first 100 yards, but it's like if you don't make it to the end, it's really like, really? Who cares? If I said, I entered every marathon this year. How far did you run, Lynn? 100 yards? You'd be like, don't want to hear any more about that. Farming. There's a lot of farming parables and illustrations, and that's really about choices. Military. Paul's illustration of the suit of armor, preparation. And then building is often used for us in the idea of planning. So fixing your eyes on something, what does that mean? I'm going to fix my eyes on John. And he's fixing his eyes on me. It's a little creepy, but I brought up the illustration, so we're fixing our eyes on each other. Well, what it means is not to move, to be focused. So he uses that illustration, and these common things that we find in the New Testament are all very good examples of fixing your eyes on endurance, choices, preparation, and planning.
The whole discourse of Hebrews is fixed his eyes on Jesus.
It is. Now, I've always looked at Hebrews as as a sermon being recorded. Now, I've shared with several that I think it's one of Paul's sermons, probably his favorite sermon that he liked to deliver to Jewish congregations, and someone wrote it down. Whether it was Barnabas, whether it was John, whether it was Apollos, and someone wrote it down. Because for the first few centuries, every writer attributes Hebrews to Paul. But it's not a letter. You go back to the beginning. He doesn't open it like a letter. And chapter 11 seems to be, where he's getting to the end of his sermon and his point being driven home. Now, in this section, he's kind of like almost going through a short recap to say, here's the application of it. Now, when Jim gets to chapter 13, he may not have looked at this, but there's a verse there early on which says, amen. And then right after that, it sounds very much like a letter, thanking people, encouraging, individuals and doing things like that. So I think, let me just flip over there real quick. And I was looking for the verse that ends with amen. But I'll let Jim explore that thought whether chapter 13 is really the end of a sermon and then some friendly notes being written. Because if you look at the very last section of 13, like 18 through 25, it sounds very much like one of Paul's letters where he like greet this person, greet that person, and I'm writing this and carrying on. But the rest of the book doesn't sound like a letter that is so typical in the New Testament. I really think it is one of Paul's sermons being delivered to Jewish people. Because we know preachers like to preach their favorite sermon over and over again. And someone probably said, Paul, you've preached this lesson so many times, I'm going to write it down because we need to save it for posterity. So here in this section, he ends with these thoughts here that, let me flip my page. That we are to focus on all of the things of Christianity. And I think really the idea of endurance, choices, preparation, and planning really help us do that. We have not yet shed blood in fighting of sin. Well, it's interesting because so many of the apostles did shed their blood. Stephen, the first martyr, did shed his blood. I think the reference here is kind of twofold. Maybe in that one sense that we have not really struggled where we have done that, but Jesus came and shed his blood. We are not anywhere equal to Jesus in any way, sense, or form, much less as a sacrifice. He was the perfect lamb, the perfect sacrifice, and the shedding of his blood removed sins because he had no guilt. Hebrews tells us he was without sin. So, questions, comments, or thoughts on any of the section of 1 through 4?
Back to that,
Oh, go ahead, Marcia.
keeping your eyes on Jesus.
Yes.
Luke 9 talks about anybody that puts their hands in the plow and looks back is not worthy of the kingdom of heaven. So once we leave that old life, that's gone. And we need to quit looking back to the old life and only look toward Jesus if we're going to heaven to be with him forever.
All right, Marcia, your comment was good about not looking back, putting your hand to the plow. And what's probably the most, the strongest story of someone looking back to where they were? Lot's wife turned to a pillar of salt. Any idea why it was a pillar of salt and not pepper or gold or whatever? Salt of the earth. I think that's where that saying came from. One is the salt of the earth. Yes.
Fire and brimstone came down and what did everything turn into? Salt.
All right.
So be careful of what you're looking to. Focus. Because there you are looking also. So maybe her looking back.
Okay.
What that became.
All right. Good thought. Jay, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, we just really need to cling on to this idea of perseverance and endurance. And you go back and look at all those folks we talked about last week, going through chapter 11. And I mean, some of those individuals, they have really high highs and really low lows. But their eyes are still fixed on the promises the whole time. And that's why they're kind of pointed out as examples. So for us, we're going to have some really good days and probably more not good days than good days. So you just gotta endure. You gotta have that perseverance and stamina to get to the finish line. It's not a sprint.
All right. I agree with what Jay said, that the great cloud of witnesses, especially the specific people that are mentioned, it's based on their faith. On some of them, we have so little about their life. Abel, we have the story of, him being the son of Adam and Eve and his brother killing him. We don't have a lot of his day-to-day activities. We could even look at someone like Job, who has a whole book devoted to him, and, glean a lot of things with that. But Jay's comment is certainly very insightful. Scott?
Earlier in chapter 10, I think a couple times it says, "For he who promised is faithful." So we're looking to God as someone who's trustworthy, and then all the things that they did as a result of trusting in his promises. And that's what Jay's saying, I think, is looking forward to that. And I think even in this context, part of looking at Jesus and keeping our eyes fixed on him is right after that, realizing that he was looking at the joy
All right. And Scott's comment about endurance is certainly on target. So was there another? Oh, yes, Sherry.
For me, and probably most of us here, it's not the blatant sins that are the hindrances for me. It's more the worries of the world, the distractions of the world, the schedules, not really sin, but they can become sin. And that's what can make us lose focus and concentrate on the things we need to be concentrating on instead of letting the distractions of the world guide us.
All right, good thoughts. Sherry's comment was that, for her, she's not entangled with adultery, with lying, with fraud and stealing. Not her words, kind of my rephrasing of it. But it's the little things in life with family, work, children that sometimes will entangle us and make our. But we also have to realize that we as a Christian, part of our Christian life is being a good employee, being a good retiree, being a good member at church, being a good family person, that those are not separate apart from our Christian walk and our light, but that's part of our service to God. Let's look at the next section. In looking at my claim was the sermon is winding down. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, we find this great deal of encouragement. Here he moves into a section about God disciplining us. And we always talk about to take every passage in context, which comes from the Greek word of weaving together, like a basket, where everything has to be weaved together. And I've often struggled with this section to say, all right, great cloud of witnesses, we shouldn't be entangled by sin, and now God moves to discipline. Is this a reflection of God's thoughts that if you are entangled in sin, if you do not lay aside the encumbrances, it's going to be necessary now for him to discipline you? Read the section with me, 5 through 13. And have you forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which you have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, we have earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respect them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? And they disciplined us for a short time, seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet those who have been trained by it, afterward it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight the pathways of your feet, so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Now, I have the Greek word up there, training and education by punishment and or correction. And I have the question, how does God discipline us? We look at this section, and we don't live in the miraculous age. Even when they did, we don't see people committing a sin and them falling dead. We can look back at many Old Testament examples where people sinned. Cain was placed with a mark so that his neighbors wouldn't hunt him down and kill him. David had a child that died. We look at Job, and God had put a fence around him and was protecting him, and at some point removed that fence to let Satan come in, not for discipline or punishment. But we associate the idea of discipline with that of punishment, corporal punishment, spanking of children. There's employer punishment. You do something wrong and you get a letter or you get suspended. So even in our civil society, you commit a crime, you're sent to jail or prison in order to remove you from the population, kind of a punishment. So there are several ways that people have looked at this discipline of God. But for us, we look at it and we don't see that when we commit a sin, we see something immediately bad happen in our life, but we look to it and we often wonder, how does God discipline us in life? Now, some have looked at it and said, well, the trials that come about in life. And I've thought about, there are trials by fire. That's where you have some difficulty. There are trials of love. There are trials of wealth. And certainly those are things that God can certainly move into our lives. But God says that he will not allow us to be tempted beyond anything that we can bear. So, the illustration here is how a father disciplines his child, punishes them in some physical way. We don't find much in the New Testament saying that when you sin, God is going to bring a physical calamity upon you. The one passage that always comes to mind, 1 Corinthians, I believe it's chapter 14 or 11, where he's talking about the Lord's Supper. And he says, anyone who is abusing the Lord's Supper is going to sleep. Well, the only way that word sleep in the New Testament is used is for death. And some have wondered, well, if you abuse the Lord's Supper, is God going to kill you? Is that going to be his discipline? Well, that's such a vague concept, and we just don't see physical calamities falling upon people on earth. Now, others have said, well, you look at temptations, we're disciplined by the church, actually, let me move that to the next slide, even though my word rules shifted a little bit there and moved up. I mean, we have godly discipline, we have church discipline, we have parent and child discipline, but it kind of goes back to my same question is, how does God discipline us? Some want to say, well, he disciplines us when we come to church and we worship him and we learn and we develop and we're corrected and we grow. That has a very nice spiritual thought to it, though our typical thought of discipline is you're going to get spanked. You're going to have something bad happen to you for your bad behavior. And to look at the New Testament and say God's discipline is love in your marriage, is worship with others on Sunday morning, the prosperity he brings us to life and us learning how to deal with it. So the contextual section is, don't be entangled, don't be caught up in your sins, because God will discipline you. Any thoughts on God's discipline? Randy?
Yeah, I think we get too off on punishment when we need to focus on correction. This chapter started with focus. So correction is to correct your focus back to the right direction. Prisons, we look at prisons as punishment. What do they call themselves? Department of Corrections.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to reprogram their thinking, get back in society, get focused, do the right thing. If they can't, then they go on and stay there. But our discipline at home, we should never get angry when we're punishing our kids.
Mm-hmm.
We should love because we're trying to correct them. Another thing to look at that is punishment. You're going in the wrong direction. Is a picture of the direction you're going eternally. And so you need to come back to the positive, correct, everlasting direction.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of that wrong, hurtful, bad direction. So it's in context with focus and direction.
All right, some good thoughts now. His thought of bringing that up, that things in life are really there for correction, and he used the illustration like the Department of Corrections. We can certainly see that in the church. We can see that in marriage. We can see that in our Christian lives, that there is all these opportunities for correction. Yes.
I feel like when I see all 13 verses together, it brings it back to the very beginning, because at the end he's talking about strengthening your knees and having a straight path for your feet. So I feel like part of what's being said here is maybe the natural consequence of being weighed down and entangled at the beginning, like steals you of the joy that Scott was talking about and makes you be focused, like Sherry said, on things of this world, and you're missing that joy of enduring and looking forward, and that's part of the discipline, is sort of that natural I feel like maybe that fits together if you're looking at all the verses as one.
Correct, and that does move us on to this last point because we have just a few minutes left. So I do want to look at the last section here, talks about, hands, feet, knees. Romans 14, let's turn over to Romans 14:19. In Romans 14 and verse 19. So then let us pursue the things that would make for peace and the building up of one another. This seems to be his section. It's interesting, he doesn't mention hands, doesn't mention a neck, where other passages in the New Testament talk about how we as a congregation, we're not all hands, we're not all feet, we're not all heads, but we all supply a certain part. This certainly deals with ourselves in moving through life. Feet, knees, hands are all part of our Christian life. We are out of time. We're actually going to start with the next section in Hebrews on Wednesday night, which will be 12 and 14 is where we'll start.